I'm a sound artist and a musician, and that means that I'm interested in, as a sound artist, in everything that we can hear. And music is music, but there's plenty else going on in the soundscape that is not music, and that's of interest to me also. I'm particularly interested in the relationship between the sounds in a place, or its sound environment, or its local soundscape, and the geography, physical features of a place, and particularly the people that live there or work, and anything to do with the culture as far as it relates to the soundscape. In other words, the relationship between a place, the way it sounds, and the people that live there and all that they do. I got to that point by quite a long route. My education, or when I was at university, I studied sciences. I was a biochemist. That didn't last. I did a year MA in genetics, and then decided that I'd prefer to be a musician, and for a number of years that's what I was. My area of music is avant-garde experimental music, and in particular improvised music, which is derived, certainly in contemporary US and European style, largely from a combination of jazz and contemporary classic. I play guitar, but when it became possible, I also was involved with electronics. And recently I've started learning the Turkish saz, because, again, it's been a long trajectory, but I have become rather focused on the part of the world which starts in the Balkans and ends in China, although not exclusively so. When I was studying or playing music, I moved to Holland, and there became involved with an institute called the Institute of Sonology, which was set up as part of a music conservatory. But its interests were wider than music. It was interested in sound as a whole, as its name would suggest. And there they were much better funded than places I'd been to in the UK, and there they had the first portable tape recorder that I was able to get access to.
Start from the beginning.
1,001. That was highly significant, because for the first time I was able to go out into out of a studio and make recordings of reasonable quality. This was around 1976, by the way. That was before even the cassette had been invented. Shortly after that, the cassette was invented, and everything became much more affordable and smaller and much easier to use in terms of location recording. So I quickly bought a Sony Walkman and did for many years work with that as a recorder. My initial interest was to record wildlife. That was because as a boy I'd been kind of a serious bird watcher, fanatical in fact, and that carried with me, although the fanaticism has disappeared, the interest has continued. And the first thing I wanted to be able to record was wildlife sound. And I started to do just that. Well, as soon as you start that, of course, you realise that it's incredibly difficult to record wildlife sound, particularly in Western Europe and Southern England. I was living in Holland at the time, without there being aircraft continually flying over, traffic noise totally ubiquitous, people speaking, the usual stuff. This is inescapable. But if you are wanting to record wildlife, it is almost taboo to have a human-produced sound in the recording. It's daft. But that's the way it was, and still is in many instances. So from wishing to concentrate on wildlife, I was quickly made aware that that's impossible. One has to take the whole sound environment into account. And that includes the sounds you don't like as well as the ones that you do like. From that, my interest developed actually away from wildlife purely, but much more into the soundscape as a whole. And that's more or less where I'm still at. And in parallel with this, I was doing music. So again, an initial impetus for wishing to record was to make pieces of music that would include instruments or whatever the musical sound was, together with sounds from the environment. Initially that was wildlife sound. And I've found throughout my work that unless I have a specific project that I'm working on, nothing very much happens. There's huge numbers of ideas, but laziness kicks in unless you have a particular focus. And my focus then was on a series of pieces to do with birdsong. It wasn't actually, the pieces weren't really to do with birdsong. They were more to do with how we as humans regard birdsong, which is quite a different matter. But that was actually the one I was interested in. We either find them, we can find them beautiful, or we can find them, we have birds as pets in order to train them to sing and to speak even, and to kind of mirror our own interests in their own vocalizations. We go out and shoot them. We watch them on TV with great interest. All of these are human interactions with wildlife, completely all multi-layered, and a component of that is how we hear in those circumstances. So I made a series of pieces which were aimed for performance. These weren't just pieces that you would sit down and listen to out of loudspeakers. They were to be performed in concert, together with me playing a guitar or a bouzouki. And that's what happened first. Now I could play. Actually, I can't, because the technology for this is actually rather minimal. There's one loudspeaker, and I'm not sure that I can get my sounds from. Yeah, it is actually. So actually, I'll just have to tell you about it. That's a shame.
We could try it off the Mac. I mean, the Mac has stereo.
Yeah. I'll try and move on, because I do have CDs where we can hear something. Anyway, that was the start, and I became more interested in the whole soundscape as opposed to just the wildlife proportion of it. And that was partly because I lived in London, and I like living in cities. Now, when you deal with wildlife sound recordists, often you find that they dislike cities and in fact have moved out of a city in order to escape city noise. This was not my feeling at all. I actually like city noise. I like the hustle and the bustle and the loudness of it. And it began to worry me slightly. Well, why is it? How come I like birdsong and I like to hear it in a pristine environment, but I'm also quite happy to hear it in my back garden, which is in the middle of London? There was kind of a dichotomy and a series of questions being set up about one's aesthetic kind of reaction to something and many other types of reaction to an environment as yet unformed. So my next project was set up to deal with the sounds of London. I became more and more interested in what other people thought of the sounds or how they reacted to the sounds in which they lived daily. And in the city, of course, that's a lot. So I set up a project called Your Favourite Sound of London, which is quite simple. I go around asking as many people who are prepared to answer, what is your favourite London sound and why? And there were a few corollary questions. One was, what is your favourite site in London and why? And a few additional things like, where do you live in London? What's your age, name, if people were willing to give it. And this started in the late 90s, 1998, for a radio station. London set up its first artist-run radio station in 1998. It's called Resonance FM. It's still going and has grown much bigger and is doing extremely well. And you don't have to be in London anymore to hear it. It's streamed over the internet. But 1998 was when it started, and I did the Favourite London Sound as a project for it. In the first period, I got a few hundred replies, mostly from artist friends or students from the college that I taught at. But I don't really think it makes much difference whether they're students or artists. People outside those come up with similar answers and similar suggested sounds. I don't know how many of you have been to London. Maybe it wouldn't matter even if you had, because this project was designed for people who live there, work there, and know the place very well. And it seemed important to me that I asked the question of those people who actually know the place rather well. London's full of tourists, but and I did get answers from tourists, but I was trying not to. And the results of that were really key to getting me to the point that I now am, and because they were a big surprise. London's most famous sound, in fact it's Britain's most famous sound, are the clock chimes of Big Ben, which are famous around the world because the BBC uses them as its signature for news broadcasts. Many people know that sound through listening to radio or TV, not because they've heard it. That applies to most Londoners and most British people as well, because the noise of London is now so loud, you need to be within 500 metres of it to actually hear it. In days gone by, you could hear that over a much wider area. So in fact, the real sound of that clock, Big Ben, is rather unfamiliar even to Londoners. You have to be right by it, really, at the right time, of course, in order to hear it. However, it is a famous London sound. Nobody mentioned it, except for two people. Another famous London sound is the bells of St Paul's Cathedral. Nobody mentioned that. So what were they mentioning? Well, it was almost entirely small, everyday, utterly familiar, very mundane types of sound, such as station announcements on the trains. London's a very big city. Most people have to travel every day to work, and the journeys can last, an hour, even longer. The forms of transport are underground trains, overground trains, buses, and bikes. Well, bikes more now than then. Each have their very obvious sounds, and those were the things that people were mentioning. So people would say, my favourite London sound is the guy who makes the station announcements at Waterloo South Station on the Northern Line. And another person would say, well, my favourite sound is, I like the woman who makes the station announcements at Regent's Park Station on the south-going Bakerloo line. In other words, on one level it's the same sound, but in fact it isn't, because all those station announcements, again we're talking 10 years ago, things have changed, were done by real people. And of course everybody's different. Everybody has a different voice, a different way of doing it, and people remembered that. People, because they made that journey every single day, heard it every day, and it became a fixed sonic point on a daily routine. Other people would say, my favourite sound is the sound of post falling through the letterbox onto the floor of my home. And that is a real sound of anticipation, or fear, maybe. Another favourite, a lot of people had some favourite green space. So they would like the birds singing, but it wouldn't be just the birds singing, it would be the birds singing in my back garden on a Sunday morning, or the birds singing in my local park at the weekend, or the evening chorus in my local cemetery. In other words, people's referencing of sound was much more than the sound itself. It was referenced in terms of where they lived, what their everyday work routines, commonly carried out journeys. And these are all kind of mundane, very familiar sounds. Probably if you were asked, you would think that people would not mention these, or at least that was what I thought before I did the project. And in the end, thousands of replies have come back from London saying similar things. The list of individual sounds is actually very long. It's almost as long as the list of people who are saying them. So there's lots of information. And the other thing I noticed was that almost nobody ever said exactly the same thing as anybody else. There were some people who said, I like the sound of silence. Well, maybe a few people have said that. But the majority would fill out their sonic preference with descriptions just similar to what I've just given you. And it's a moot point. Does the sounds of birds on a Sunday morning in my back garden, are they the same sound as the sound of birds in the evening in my local park? Well, I don't suppose there's really an answer to that, but I find it very significant that people, when asked a seemingly simple question, like what is your favourite sound in London, will give rather detailed replies. That showed to me that contrary to it's often suggested that there's an area of called acoustic ecology, which I guess I'm part of. One of the initial thoughts of the acoustic ecologists was that our ability to hear was diminishing. If you compare our ability to hear with, say, people who live in the rainforest, the traditional people from the rainforest, or traditional people in Canada, for example, that's where acoustic ecology was invented, in Vancouver. Or the term was first coined, and the first studies were done in Vancouver. One of their impetuses was they disliked the fact that the world was getting louder, or city world was getting louder, and they came with this theory that we were losing our ability to hear or hear in detail, and one of the goals of an acoustic ecology should be to reduce the amount of noise in the environment. Well, you know, one can't possibly disagree with that, but there's a lot more to it than just that. But this idea that us Westerners are losing our ability to hear, I personally can't find the evidence for it. And in the replies given to the question about the favourite sound, the detail of the answer and the actual very specific nature showed that people did hear the difference between birds in one place and birds in another place, or a station announcement at one station compared to another. These were very clearly noticed in many of the replies, and I thought that was that gave me hope, I have to say. It was encouraging to find this level of detail that people hear into a loud city soundscape like London. Now, I'll try on the loudspeaker to play a couple of examples. Recorded from the street.
Peter, at what distance was that recorded?
That's directly below. So you can hear the proportion of clock sound to traffic sound, and that's by no means a loud traffic area. It's part of the London, what's the word? The zone where the traffic is not allowed in. Well, not without paying.
That's what congestion pricing.
Congestion zone, that's the word I was searching for, that's right, yeah. Anyway, so you can, and when you hear it on the BBC, of course it doesn't sound like that at all. That's because they have a microphone inside the tower, right in the chamber where the bells are, permanently on tap for their broadcasts, which of course isolates it from all the other sound from outside. Now, when I played that recording to students of one class, many of whom were not British, nobody recognised it, including the British students, because it's so different in the way it sounds for real, or, well, it's not for real, it's still through a loudspeaker, but, you know, in a different context from the one that people were mostly familiar with, which is the broadcast version. But of course, when you know, you can tell what it is. So that was another realisation, that a lot of our information about sound, we don't get it direct, we get it through the media. I mean, of course, that's, when you put it like that, it couldn't be more blatantly obvious. That's how we get all our news. That's how we get a huge amount of information, but one doesn't normally think about it in terms of sound. But it's certainly the case. Many people in the UK will instantly recognise the sound of a rainforest, but I doubt if very many of them have actually been anywhere near a rainforest. You get that from the TV. And there are plenty of examples like that. Film and television have for years, decades, had sonic cliches which designate place. Like the sound of New York to non-New Yorkers is sirens echoing through those canyon buildings, maybe with a saxophone in the background. And India always seems to have a sitar playing. That, you know, Africa is always to do with drumming. Those are kind of media cliches which we're all very familiar with, although I think, again, that's kind of an old story now. Things have changed. But it certainly was the fact, and it still doesn't mean that one's attitudes and thinking and understanding of sound aren't totally coloured by what you hear on the media. I think that's certainly the case. Film, I think, is invidious in this respect, because there's a lot of almost no film soundtrack is unconstructed sound. They are layered up, and all the different sound levels between individual sounds are very carefully controlled to give the effect that the filmmakers want. And so you listen to background atmospheres, for example, in film, say of a city or a woodland or by the sea, and think that they're real recordings. Most of them are not. And so, because it isn't discussed like it would be in the visual media, the kind of relationship between photograph and moving image compared with our own sight is a huge topic in photography, filmmaking theory. The same does not apply, unfortunately, in sound. So I think its effect is rather invidious, and that again came out from the Favourite Sounds project. Let me play. that's London Underground system, which is familiar to everybody in London, and Mind the Gaps is probably its most famous announcement. This again is 10 years ago. If you go now, there's one station left where you can hear that type of recording, that bank station in the middle of the city. Everywhere else it's been replaced by inside the train announcements and the more kind of digitalised voices which take each individual word and stick it together in a kind of slightly unreal way. So the soundscape, even in the Tube, in London's Tube, has changed in the last 10 years, as it has in many other areas. So those recordings were both made 10 years ago. The project still continues, and I carry on asking the same question. And modern examples show you how a city has changed. And one good example of that is in the buses. The older buses had a cord running down the length of them, which you would put your hand up and yank like this, and on the other end was a bell. And if you yanked the bell once, then the driver would know that to stop at the next stop. Well, there isn't a single bus left which has that system. Now we have a buzzer, and it goes or some variation. And before that change, the bell on the London bus was a uniquely London sound, and that was a well-mentioned favourite London sound. After its disappearance, absolutely nobody has mentioned the buzz on a London bus. So much so that even the Transport for London hierarchy has noticed, and they have begun to put in, instead of buzzing sounds, electronic samples of bells, which sound like a bell, but they do not sound like a real bell. And one of the effects, when you were kids in London, you used to play with these things, because every time you pull it, it has a different ring, and that's fun. Every time you push the buzzer with a sample bell on it, it comes out exactly the same. It's completely unnatural. So it actually isn't the same at all. Now you might think, and certainly the Transport for London policymakers think, that this is utterly trivial, not worth spending a lot of time on. But to me, these are issues which give a place its character and are part of what makes us identify or relate to particular places. It is the difference between a real bell that sounds different between every time you pull it, compared with one which is electronic and it sounds exactly the same whatever you do, that makes the difference between that being a kind of enjoyable or just a characterful tiny little detail of a city which is actually very important. And you know, I've become rather interested in the fact that those differences can be absolutely tiny yet highly significant. It's very difficult to think of a science that can measure a difference like that, and certainly an economic system which can find any significance in that. But when it comes to us listening and everyday life and millions of Londoners who hear them on a daily basis, there is a significance. And you know, I've become interested in that greatly since. A current project, which kind of is has stemmed from the Favourite Sounds project, is that 2 years ago, out of the blue, I was invited by the Engineering and Physical Science Research Council. That's the body which funds science and engineering projects for UK academic research funding. In other words, they have lots of money to cover those areas. I was invited to what they called a sand pit, which was a week, or rather 5 days, in a country hotel, very nice, together with 25 other people, academics or artists, and an administrative structure and facilitators to make the thing go with a swing, on the subject of future noise, or the noise of the future. The majority of the people at that were acousticians or engineers, but there were mathematicians, sociologists, psychoacousticians, biologists with an interest in environment, and several artists. I was one. And the idea of that was to brainstorm for a week and come up with some fairly well worked out proposals for research projects into any aspect of the soundscape of the future, or the noise of the future, and what to do about them that we could coherently manage in the time. And the incentive for that was £1 million that they could sort of basically give out there and then to the, not all to one project, but they wanted to find 3 projects which they could split the money between. Unfortunately for me, I was in one of the winning bids. It's kind of all, everything happens by accident, I'm convinced by it. And the project I was involved in became known as the Positive Soundscape Project. And there are basically 7 people involved, 2 artists, engineer, 2 acousticians, a sociologist, a psychoacoustician, and a biologist. And the intention of that project was trying to turn the idea of our city or urban environment just being full of noise into seeing it from a positive angle, and saying, well, the Favourite Sounds project, plus much other research, does show what people find valuable about our everyday sound environment, even in urban Western society. Maybe for the it would be good to look at it from that point of view, rather than regarding every sound as noise, which is where the current legal system and often the local government and environmental officer attitude is to sound. And we had to work collaboratively across the disciplines, and I must say it's been incredibly hard. But I do think it's been valuable. We're now 2 years into that. There's another year to go. And during that period, I've become, my designation has been changed to being a research fellow. And the advantage of that is that I don't have to teach during the time that I'm doing research, which has actually been a relief. So it's been very interesting to see how those different disciplines approach the idea of the soundscape and finding what might be positive within it. One of our other explicit aims is to try and present the information in such ways that it would be valuable to those professions whose decisions actually can make a difference, i.e. architects, urban planners, and local or national government environment departments. This is just one small piece of research that is going on in those areas, and I don't want to give the impression that there isn't a lot of other stuff going on too. But the context of it is quite interesting. One of my, after the Favourite Sounds project, I became involved with the Greater London Authority, that's the local government for the City of London. Their environment department were charged with rewriting the noise policy for London. And the person there, named Max Dixon, is an incredible guy. He's been busy with sound and environmental policy for most of his working life. And he's in fact incredibly knowledgeable about it all. But not only that, he is also interested in music and sound art and is very knowledgeable about those areas. He's the single most knowledgeable in a wide spectrum point of view person about sound that I've ever met. And he's head of the sound section of the environment department of the GLA. He's the only guy in it. That shows the level of commitment to sound in the environment. So don't run away with the idea that this is all terribly what's the word? It's supported or is going to produce big results. It isn't, but at least there is something there. And he invited artists, architects, environmental people together to discuss these issues. And I became aware then that our sound environment, the way it is not just to do with the machines that we use, the way we behave, the way we speak, the kind of way that our cities are organised, but also to do with the legislation and the laws and regulations that have a bearing on those matters. There are building regulations which control the porosity or the sonic porosity of wall spaces, the walls, for example. There are others which determine whether you can put an air conditioning unit here or it has to be 50 metres somewhere else, because if it's too close to another one, then the combined level of that will be above a particular limit. All these things which at first sight seem incredibly boring, very dull, very abstruse, and often couched in impregnable languages, actually affect what we're hearing. So they are important. And I got to know a little bit about that too. And some of that knowledge has gone into the Positive Soundscapes project. The sociologist is doing sound walks with different groups of people, and that means getting a group of, say, architects together, choosing a route in the city, walking around them, stopping them in various key points, being quiet for 5 minutes or so that people can concentrate on hearing, and then walking on to the next part. And then she will take them back and they'll have a discussion. She'll ask them a list of questions about what they've heard, how they think about it, that kind of sociological process. The scientists are doing Fmri studies. Those are where they can look at the brain activity and they are playing very short sections of recordings from soundscapes and specific sounds and watching the brain activity while listening to those examples. The biologist is doing physiological tests, i.e. heart rate, breathing rate, skin responses with similar samples to see if there are any sort of autonomic biological responses that we have. And there's the sound walks, as I mentioned. Us artists are doing various things too. I'm carrying on with the Favourite Sounds project because I think now, 10 years later from the first one, the difference in 10 years will come out rather clearly from that. And we're also doing one in Manchester. The project's actually based in Manchester rather than London, to see what the differences between Manchester and London may be. All of which has got to come together in the next year. There'll be papers, reports, and an exhibition, and CDs, and a website. But I think it actually is going to be quite difficult to coordinate the different perspectives. But interesting, very interesting. I'm not saying it won't be attempted. I'm saying that there are quite serious issues. For example, you think of the word soundscapes, one of the basic words dealing with this area. What do you actually mean by a soundscape? You've got to be very specific. How long does a soundscape last? What's the difference? An individual sound is fairly obvious, but if you listen to 8 seconds of something, are you hearing a soundscape, or are you only hearing an individual sound? The reason that kind of, what again might appear to be an insignificantly tiny detail comes up is because the fMRI brain scanning technology will only work with very short samples. So are they testing soundscapes, or are they testing only individual sounds? That is a question. And if they are only testing individual sounds, what relevance to the positiveness of the soundscape is this work? It calls into question on people's methodologies in a way which it probably wouldn't if we were still working within our own disciplines. And I think that's really valuable. But it's kind of traumatic at times. But I think it's very important. Anyway, maybe I've spoken enough about that. I did this Favourite Sounds project in China, in Beijing to be precise, and that was funded by the British Council. They're responsible for promoting British arts in the rest of the world outside Britain. China, of course, is a country where everybody is trying to promote themselves at the moment in every possible way. So a lot of British artists have gone to China in the last few years. But I did the same project there, and that was rather interesting.
Peter, have you ever done any projects, or are you aware of any projects that are looking at changes in soundscapes chronologically? I mean, you mentioned several examples of 10 years ago versus today, but in terms of both city or urban environments, but also more pristine natural environments.
Yes, the original Vancouver Soundscape project, which is the Canadian one, as I mentioned earlier, they set up a research department in the university there called the World Soundscape Project. And initially they did that kind of studies. Part of their interest was the fact that Canadian sounds were disappearing, a lot of traditional Canadian sounds to do with traditional industries and the languages of the traditional peoples there are dying out. And one of the reasons for them setting up this project, they wanted to archive by recording those sounds before they disappeared. And they did quite a lot of research on the history of those changes. You can do this by going back as far as recordings go, which is kind of the 20s. Well, there are earlier ones, but not very comprehensive. It's when radio kicks in that you get lots of sound recordings being made, or the film industry. But radio tend to make better recordings, more comprehensive recordings than the film industry. So radio archives are a really good source of historical sonic information, not just in the Western world, but all over the world. It's quite extraordinary, some of their archives, actually.
I'm wondering also, especially about natural sounds.
Yeah, well, those archives actually have a huge number of natural sound recordings. Like my own trajectory, the trajectory of recording often was either concentrated on wild sound or on human voice and music.
With regard to the positive sounds, is that what's called positive sounds?
Soundscapes project, yeah.
What you're looking for is the soundscapes that people find pleasant. Positive.
Well, positive and pleasant, that's another conversation we've had, are not the same thing, but basically yes.
Okay, so is the ultimate potential, I have two questions, is the ultimate potential application of that to engineer a soundscape that is more positive or more pleasant for people, say, in urban landscapes? And the second question I have, I mean, you can imagine actually layering over sounds to add resonance to
yes, yes, yes.
The other question I have is the function of sounds is not only positive, it's for warnings and
yes, indeed,
of danger and so forth.
Yeah.
So isn't that an important part of the soundscape as well?
That's right. So that's why I kind of question the link, the kind of direct link between positive and pleasure, because positiveness means, or one of the aspects of that is that we can hear things clearly, for example. Now, what we hear clearly might be unpleasant and a warning sound, but we still need to hear it clearly, and if we can't, then that is not a positive soundscape, because...
For example, in an urban landscape where you can't hear someone scream,
that's right.
Sounds, you'd say that's a negative.
Yes. And this idea of engineering as well, I think that has to be quite thoroughly looked at, because the one imagining, for example, well, let's make this town square more positive, stick in a load of loudspeakers, place a nice sound, that'll be more positive. And if that's the response, I'd probably go and shoot myself or something. And because it would be much too engineered and manufactured. My own angle on this is that because I travel a lot and visit in particularly Turkey, Azerbaijan, Russia, Western China, Islamic China, those parts of countries where you still find relatively quite different types of urban living, where you can still hear human sounds in all their detail really clearly. Those to me are positive soundscapes. They're not drowned out by traffic. I mean, they have lots of disadvantages. Often these are slums. So, you know, if you asked anybody, well, would you like to move to a slum in order to have a positive soundscape? You know, clearly that would be nonsense. But one of the things that slums do have is the ability to hear what's going on around you in a lot of detail and very clearly. Our urban, suburban living does not allows that from garden to garden, perhaps, but not in the same kind of way. So my take on positiveness is that it's actually it's a complex idea, and it contains elements not of individual sounds being there or not, but, say, the ability to hear them clearly, the ability to hear into the distance so you can get sonically what's going on a fair distance away from you, the variability of it. our urban soundscape is very monotonous and homogeneous.
Monoculture.
It is, and I would say sonic monoculture is a negative from my own point of view. So to engineer, for me, would be a question of arranging things so that there is a variability, so there is a preference for a wide variety of human sounds that we can hear clearly, in fact any sound that we can hear clearly. Those types of things, they're not specific to individual sounds, but to environments as a whole, or sort of hearable environments as a whole. That means that you may not be able to do very much about existing towns and cities where you can't change the buildings, but if you're planning new towns, as they are indeed doing in China to a huge volume, you could, if you had the mind, plan in the ability for different environments. This area has got a lot of green, that's got much harder surfaces, so that when you walk through, you get different sound environments. Your footsteps would sound different in different places. Now, there are places like that a lot. Old Italian cities like Bologna, which have traffic-free 11th to 14th century intact city centres. When you walk through those streets, you can hear yourself, you can hear your footsteps, you can hear you don't have to shout to speak to your companion. You hear people playing music in windows 2 stories up. You hear the markets some streets away. These, to me, are how it should be. Our own towns and cities are not like that, but you can make them so. Like Coventry is another area we've been studying. It actually has a traffic-free it's entirely new. Coventry was totally flattened during the Second World War, so its city centre is new. But it has been built in an old towny sort of way. There are kind of town squares and passageways to the next. They're all lined with your normal shops like Marks and Spencer's or Woolworths or Starbucks these days. But again, that's okay because the different shapes and sizes of them make for different kind of acoustic environments in different parts. Where you have it laid out in a much more grid or open structure, that doesn't happen. So the way you lay out an area from a planning or an architectural point of view has a big effect on the soundscape. You don't have to put individual sounds there. If you plan an area, it can make use of the sounds that will happen there, but they will be hearable properly. And that'll be and most of those will be human-produced sounds. One of the things that came up in the future Soundscapes is that the dominant sound in most of the world now is traffic. Now that, again, hasn't always been like that. That's been like that for most of the 20th century and grown to the point that it is now. In the next decades, it will change again because as oil becomes more expensive, the move towards different kinds of automobile engine is gathering pace. So we already have hybrids and electrically driven cars, and that will obviously continue, and in the end they will replace or swamp out the petrol engine. When that happens, our soundscape will be radically different from the one that we hear now. The tyre sound will still be very significant, but it will be a big change nevertheless.
Question about positive, the idea of it implies meaning, and the same sound may have completely different meanings for different people. When I was a kid, there was this faraway machine sound that I think of nostalgically, and that's summers and making things. But to my father, it was rezoning and putting in an industrial zone near the house. It wasn't there when he got it. So a completely different reaction.
Yeah.
The cars, already, the blind are complaining about Priuses.
Yeah.
Because they cannot hear them coming. So the blind have come to depend on this noise pollution, if you will.
Well, it's not just the blind. I think we all cross streets without looking because we believe we're going to hear it. And they also said that they would expect the number of traffic accidents to go up for a while until we got.
He does love it. So it's. This is the thing about talk about this idea of monoculture. I noticed that there are sounds that are intentional, voices, bells, warnings, whistles, and then there are sounds which are incidental but beloved, maybe Environmental Protection Agency for sounds, that kind of thing. But then there are things that are just pervasive. Is there any move to quiet buses?
Well,
that kind of a thing.
It's not. It's where you come up against economics. I mean, it's not as if these problems are unknown. I mean, Transport for London and noise consultants, they know which buses are quiet and which are noisy. But if there's X amount of money, then they buy what they can buy, and that's usually the noisier bus. So it's a question of raising sound as a significant issue. At the moment it has a very low profile, but I think that is changing also, albeit slowly. But until it's discussed, it gets more of an airing in the same way that visual light pollution, you compare it with light pollution, there's a much bigger drive to get rid of light pollution than to get rid of noise pollution. And why should that be? Noise pollution has been, well, they've both been with us for a long time, but the awareness of visual phenomena is clearly much greater in our current society than for sound. But if you are interested in that, the only thing you can do is just keep banging on about it, which is, I'm afraid, what I do in various contexts. My projects, my involvement with the non-artistic community, and the London governments, and this Soundscapes project, for example. That's what I can do. I agree, it's hardly going to be noticeable, but that's what you have to make. You have to kind of plot your own route.
Do you have a place where people can go to buy your CDs?
Yes.
Do you have your own website?
I don't have my own website. Most of the CDs are produced by record companies who have their own websites, and some distributors will distribute. But for example, there's a record company, there's a distribution record label, which some of them are out on, called RER. If you type in RER Megacore and then search for my name, you'll find what's available there. In fact, it's basically everything available on that site. I'm not sure about the States, I have to say.
Also get them on Amazon.
Oh, you can. That's true. You can get them on Amazon. That's right. So, you can't go into a shop and find them, but you can on the internet. Yeah.
Someday, though, right?
Maybe. But the whole selling of music scene is changing so fast that it may not be relevant soon.
But so as an artist, how do you get people to listen to you? In other words, when you're not doing music, right? In a Positive Soundscapes project, for instance, or in your other environmental work,
that is pretty difficult. So I do, during concerts, I will play environmental sounds, but then there is a confusion with music, and the whole thing is not terribly satisfactory. But I do quite a lot of radio shows, and I do talk a lot, and in this kind of circumstance. And CDs are available, and a lot of the projects that I do, particularly the Favourite Sounds project, are you can't do on your own. You need to involve people in the doing of them, and that's certainly the case in Beijing, where I couldn't obviously speak a word of Chinese. I'd never been to the city before, so how do you operate in that kind of instance? I couldn't do it other than by giving workshops to students in the music conservatory and in the art school, and then asking them if they would go around, talk to people, and make a lot of recordings themselves. And that there was a carrot in this, in that the British Council provided recording equipment which the institutions could keep afterwards. So they were interested for that reason. Although it has to be said, some of the Beijing Chinese universities had much better equipment anyway. But the individual students didn't necessarily have access to it in the same way that our students probably would. It's different systems. So it meant involving a lot of people. There was quite a lot of media interest. It was before the build-up to the Olympic Games in Beijing. It was 2 years before that. So there was an interest amongst in the people planning the cultural side of the Games in the sounds at all. And in fact, led to nothing. But at the time I was there, there were discussions, so we had talks with people involved in that. But they were very interested in the idea of archiving. Beijing as a city is changing incredibly fast right now, and it has been for the last 20 years. But for the moment, a lot of traditional Beijing sounds are still there, and the ones that London lost 100 years ago are still there in Beijing, together with all the new ones that have come in. So at the moment, the soundscape of Beijing is incredible to hear, because it has mixtures of traditional and new. And there is still a chance to archive it and record it before it disappears. And they were really interested in that. They're even talking about setting up a sound museum in Beijing. Again, I have no idea whether that will actually come to anything, but it was one of the ideas being actively discussed. So we, as artists, took part, again, minimally, but in those discussions. And they were outside the art scene. So that's how it has an effect, I think. It's long term. It's not like you get audiences of 1,000 to every concert, but then I play music, which never did anyway. And I think for me, radio, and eventually the internet, I want to make a really comprehensive map-based, not just map, but map-based website which will layer London, Beijing, wherever together, enable comparisons to be made. Now, for that I need to collaborate with very, very sort of high-end web designers and graphic designers, and I'm trying to set that up as a part of this Positive Soundscapes project. But again, it's not easy. They're not familiar areas to most web designers either.
In light of the hour, I think we should thank the speaker.